Meanwhile, the Committee to Protect Journalists has labelled the decision to deny bail to an investigative journalist in Zimbabwe a vindictive move by authorities. A High Court judge dismissed an appeal for bail by journalist Hopewell Chin'ono, which means his week-long detainment over charges of inciting violence could continue indefinitely. Both the United Nations Secretary-General and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has called on Zimbabwe's authorities to live up to their human rights obligations. Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us now from New York to talk a little bit more about this. So, Sherwin, you have spoken to the CPJ about this and the UN. What is the reaction and thoughts of the possible role moving forward on this particular issue?
So let's talk about the UN in a little bit, right? It's complicated because where does the human rights situation playing itself out in Zimbabwe belong? People are talking about it possibly going to the UN Security Council. There's another argument for it to be handled by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, but we'll get to that. I did, of course, as you correctly point out, speak a short time ago to the Africa Program Director for the Committee to Protect Journalists that's based in New York. They called the decision in the High Court a vindictive decision by Zimbabwean authorities. They raised concern about Hopewell's condition in being remanded in jail in Harare, given the COVID-19 pandemic and the risks that are now apportioned to people that are being detained. Let's listen to a segment of that interview with Angela Quintal that I had a short time ago.
Obviously, we're very, very disappointed. We're still waiting to see the judgments that we can understand why the judge decided to refuse the appeal. But it obviously has implications just in terms of, Hopewell himself. Let's just talk about the fact that he is in remand prison. We know that the remand prison in Harare, conditions there are appalling, overcrowded. We are talking about a COVID-19 pandemic, and clearly we're concerned about his health. And so, over and above the fact that, frankly, what he did could not be considered a crime.
So, Angela, in the Zimbabwe context, this is not just about Hopewell Chin'ono's case, correct?
Of course not. There have been several cases. In fact, Zimbabwe's probably got the worst record in terms of attacks on journalists since the COVID-19 lockdown started in April. We have two other journalists currently in jail, Sam Takawira and Frank Chikawore, who are facing charges of contravening lockdown regulations simply because they were at a hospital to interview three opposition activists. We've seen other journalists who've been attacked, intimidated, harassed, and more recently, we saw the case of Nduduzi Matatu, who's in hiding, whose home was raided, whose sister was actually detained in an attempt to lure him. So we've seen a very, very bad record in terms of how the press is treated in Zimbabwe. And I'm afraid that the fact that Hopewell's bail has been denied is obviously going to affect the media at large.
And I also asked Angela Tepiso what happens now given this judgment, and their focus is really going to turn to getting an explanation of that High Court judgment, but also really to pressurizing regional bodies like SADC, for example, where, as you well know, there's an upcoming extraordinary heads of state and government summit coming up in just a few days.
That's SADC, Sherwin, but I'm wondering, as we mentioned, the fact that the UN chief and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have spoken about respecting human rights. But, the reaction on social media has been quite, violent in its rejection, especially of the Zimbabwe regime, on them dismissing what is actually happening. You heard earlier on them saying that these are doctored images. Could this make it to the UN Security Council?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think we've been to this rodeo before in 2007, 2008, at the height of the land invasions, the disputed election in Zimbabwe, where Morgan Tsvangirai, the late former MDC opposition leader, won the first round and then withdrew from the second round due to intimidation from ZANU-PF at the time. That did get itself onto the agenda of the UN Security Council, but against the opposition from countries like South Africa that was there under the leadership of former Ambassador Dumisani Khumalo, who at times very eloquently made the case for why Zimbabwe's domestic situation was not a threat to international peace and security, which would then mean that it could go on before the UN Security Council. He would make the argument for the matter to be dealt with by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. What you had at that time, Tsepiso, was a resolution presented by the United States and Britain that would have imposed sanctions, economic punitive measures against the government of then President Robert Mugabe, and would appoint a UN mediator to mediate, because there was not a lot of confidence in the mediation process that was unfolding under the auspices of former President Thabo Mbeki. That resolution failed. It was vetoed by China and Russia, and also didn't win the support of an additional 3 countries, including South Africa, Libya, and Vietnam. And Dumisani Khumalo made the case then that this was a situation where African solutions needed to be found for African problems. Of course, that didn't resonate with his colleagues, particularly Western colleagues at the time, as he made the case for Zimbabwe to be the situation to be handled before the Human Rights Council. The argument, certainly within UN corridors, is that country situations tend to devolve when human rights violations occur. So that's the beginning point, and it's always an indication of things to come in the future. So the big concern is that when human rights violations, as we are seeing themselves play out in Zimbabwe, that they could then at a later stage lead to questions of international peace and security when it then does become the mandate of the Security Council. So it's a very interesting distinction to be made. It has been on the Council before. It did not see passage of various resolutions, attempts at that. And I think we are probably going to see a similar scenario play itself out were certain countries to push for this situation to be brought before the UN Security Council.
And Sherwin, the CPJ has told you that they've written a letter to President Cyril Ramaphosa in his capacity as AU chair. And I was thinking earlier on, watching the ANC Secretary General speaking to our colleague Mzwandile Mbeja about the handling of this issue, speaking about leadership styles. Now, I'm wondering, what are they saying to President Ramaphosa? What are they expecting in their appeal to him?
Well, they're throwing the organization, the African Union's documents into the face, essentially, of the African Union chairperson. They refer to the Declaration of People's Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa, which was adopted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Tsepiso. This is the quasi-judicial body that focuses on human rights within the African Union, similar to the Human Rights Council in Geneva that focuses on human rights issues in the United Nations. And this is a body that reports to the heads of the AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government. And so what they are saying is there is a document that Principle 19 of that document talks about the right to express oneself through media by practicing journalism, and that it shall not be subject to undue legal restrictions. This is what they put in this letter to President Ramaphosa. Principle 20 of the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information says that states shall be liable for the conduct of law enforcement, security, intelligence, the military, and other personnel which threatens, undermines, or violates safety of journalists and other media practitioners. So they are essentially, in this letter to President Ramaphosa, quoting the very African Union documents that speak to the very issues they're trying to correct. They're saying the documents exist, member states must adhere to them, enforce what it is your member states have agreed to. Essentially, that's the argument they make in this letter to President Ramaphosa. They also said to me that they did receive recognition, confirmation of the letter's receipt, but nothing further than that.
Right. Thanks for that, Sherwin. SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. He is in New York. So let's see what the response is.